have a new episode for the Build and Learn series in Stanford Bay. In recent episodes, we've been expanding our city along the coastline, creating various mixed-use areas, and today we're going to cap off that with a beautiful baseball stadium with a great view of downtown and some modern residential and commercial spaces. So make sure you hit the subscribe button, leave a like, and drop a comment down below with your thoughts on the episode. And don't forget, if you are new to the series, you can catch up with the playlist that's listed on my channel for Build and Learn in Stanford Bay. So let's jump right into getting our stadium in place. Part of what this is going to take is ample amount of space, not only to get your stadium in, but also you need enough room to add some parking, especially if you're looking to recreate sort of a North American stadium. I've drawn out just a couple of roads, an extension of some of the things that we worked on in our previous episode. And not only do I want to put a stadium here and parking, I also want to work on adding sort of an uptown area. So in the last episode, we worked on Midtown, which was meant to connect our downtown to different parts of our city that we were going to build out later. So I'm considering this our uptown area, whatever you want to dub it, but it's just another extension of what we've already built. And I told you guys, I like to build sort of in sectors or regions of our city. So sometimes I'll block that out using streets, and it might just be 2 to 3, maybe 4 blocks that I want to focus on. And that is very much how I'm operating with this episode. I know that I want to incorporate a stadium as our point of interest, but around that, I also want to incorporate commercial and residential to feature around the stadium. Additionally, I wanted to make sure the stadium had a very unique view back at the downtown that's uninterrupted by other buildings. But I will admit to you guys right now that it took a whole lot of time for me to choose buildings that I felt fit what I was looking for here. I've often suggested to build things that you know, and one stadium I visited not too long ago was the Atlanta Braves Stadium in Atlanta. And not only did they build a stadium, but they built a whole area sort of tucked next to the highway that features everything, including offices, shops, residential, all packed into this little sector of Atlanta. And I thought that was kind of cool, so I wanted to take some inspiration from that. I don't know if I quite executed it the way I intended to or the way I want to, but I was able to accomplish quite a bit that I think starts to get there in creating a very modern space at this edge of town. And one thing you should keep in mind, especially considering how dense this area is going to be, is to allow for public transportation. So we're going to put a bus station here on the corner, and then I'm going to start building in the area next to the stadium, starting with this very unique looking building that I thought was really cool. I'm not really sure what it is, but I thought this looked really good on the coastline. And generally I know certain things that I want to include. Like we want some apartments, hotels, we want some office space, we want some shops and commercial areas. So it took me a while to figure out what buildings to actually pull for this, and it didn't quite give me the density that I was looking for. But I did want to keep with modern buildings. So I went to King Leno's Link Casino. I'm incorporating that, not because it's a casino, but because I think it lends itself to sort of a modern area. And what I'm kind of assuming is that the stadium is relatively new. Perhaps they just moved the team here, which is something that often happens. And this is the new place that they're playing. In addition to that, they also included some buildings around it as a part of this whole building process, right? Which is something I'm seeing crop up more like in different cities where they're not only building a stadium, but they're building areas around the stadium. They're sort of revitalizing a specific area or giving an area more purpose around the stadium itself. And so one way that I try to set this up is I set up some networks that can accommodate the space that I need, or at least to some extent. And then I try to do what I've done in previous episodes where I start working within that space to create whatever I'm looking for, right? It's that puzzle we've been doing the last couple episodes as we fill up areas with different things. The work I did in this episode is really a combination of the last 2 episodes, right? I want to incorporate low density areas as well as high density areas. I don't know that this one space I'm working in right now really quite met the expectation. It's a little bit spread out. It didn't quite work the way I wanted, but it's not terrible. It just has like a little green space in the middle, kind of like a little pocket for, you know, pedestrians just to walk through, which might be beneficial in terms of just general traffic movement, but still wasn't quite what I was hoping to build in terms of how dense it was in the interior. One interesting thing that I find is that when I'm building cities and I work within a confined space, so for example, I have the railroad there. So everything I do in this area needs to fit within the railroad and the coastline. Limiting myself that way often creates interesting results because I tend to get a little bit resourceful in how I lay certain things out and how I plan areas, which I think in some contexts is actually very helpful because it's often, you know, a thing where you can kind of get overwhelmed with everything that you're building as you expand your city. Like, where can you go? You can go everywhere. So finding opportunities again to sort of constrain what you're working on and take it like step by step is helpful for me, and hopefully something that you guys can use if you get stuck. The content creator pack that Bad Peanut worked on that has all these stadiums in it is actually super, super helpful for creating points of interest in your city. This is something I've been talking a little bit about in recent episodes. And the point of that is just giving your city certain buildings or certain things that are unique to that city. And I think stadiums are one thing you can utilize from a vanilla standpoint to help create something unique about your city or something that you can feature about your city. In addition to using Bad Peanut's assets from the content creator pack, I'm also using King Lino's commercial content creator pack, which is the building I just put on the corner. Plus, I'm going to add this hotel here. Again, mixing what all we're using in this space. I want it to look modern, and I want it to be relatively dense with things that people can kind of come here and enjoy and hang out next to the stadium. The whole idea here is that you could come over to this area in the afternoon and spend all day and then go to the game in the evening or whatever, right? I'm also going to be looking to combine some buildings to make them make better sense or to work them out so that multiple sides are kind of presentable. So for example, the hotel where I just kind of inverted it on both sides. I don't like when you have the buildings that are sort of open in the middle, right? With nothing there, they tend to look incomplete. So I'll often flip the building, duplicate it and flip it to the other side and have them kind of work within each other to create a complete building, if that makes sense. And I can't forget about using these brush packs. These are so helpful for filling space because, as we all probably know by now, Surface Painter does a good job in certain areas and not a great job in some areas. And then additionally in this space, I can also add in a bunch of parking to help accommodate the amount of traffic we're gonna have in this area. I'm also gonna disable parking from the streets so that we don't have a bunch of cars just lining the roads, especially when I have so much parking available. And as I'm working on this, one thing that popped in my head was that last week I said that the video itself in terms of recording came together so easily. And this week was the exact opposite. This week's video was so hard because I just kept moving buildings around. There's a lot that I cut in terms of me just like placing a building here and there and just realizing, no, that doesn't fit. It was a lot of like plopping and deleting. So I kind of cleared out some of that because it just wasn't really adding much value. But man, just so you guys know, this takes some time in planning to figure out. Like, as much as I try to keep in, some of the process, there are some things where it just gets redundant with me putting down almost the same buildings on repeat just to try to find stuff that fits the area. And one thing I didn't really get to incorporate as much in this episode is also some of the detailing I had to do. I did some of that off camera because the video was just getting longer and longer and longer. And it turns out that when I started placing this, I really didn't plan well in terms of how much detailing really needed to go into the space to really make it pop and stand out. It felt very flat and kind of boring. And I've gone in and added some trees and some various things that you'll see in the end cinematics to give you a little bit better of an impression of what all I did to kind of make the area, again, just sort of stand out in its own. I think what's really great with these sort of projects in terms of doing like points of interest are it challenges you in a different way. So if you set up a stadium or some sort of amusement park, you have to work around that area and incorporate it into your city. If you just drop it in the middle of a neighborhood, it's not really going to make a ton of sense. But you also don't want to like bury your points of interest. Like if you have something that is very unique to the city, you don't want to just bury it amongst buildings. You want it to be featured in a way, but ultimately finding ways of blending something like this, something so unique, into the rest of your city is an important challenge. And it's something that I really recommend practicing here and there and trying to find ways of like taking a baseball stadium, for example, which is such a large building just in terms of surface area, and incorporating it into your city in a way where you don't feel like it's just popped down and nothing is sort of built around it that makes it seem like it belongs, if that makes sense. And it's not just about the buildings you select. It's also about how you set up the area to make it blend in, by using paths that sort of connect to other paths, things that can integrate it within your city. Additionally, vegetation is important. You want to find some sort of consistency with your vegetation. So oftentimes I'll pick out trees or I'll pick out certain bushes that I use sort of repetitively to create cohesion across multiple different parts of my city. And I should probably just re-emphasize planning your city and taking those steps to really nail down a few things in terms of your theme, vegetation, and how your city is set up, and kind of the history behind it can all lend itself to helping you figure out how to integrate different areas in the city. Because if you have that baseline bit of information of where you plan on going and where the city comes from, you can really establish those things early and just reflect on them when you need to apply those changes to new areas as you start and continue to develop your city. Here's another thing. You may see me bounce around a lot. Like sometimes I'll be doing some buildings, placing some things, and then I'll jump over and start doing like some random detail, right? Like placing fences around the stadium. More times than not, it kind of helps me figure out different areas. So I may jump over to doing a fence or some vegetation somewhere. Meanwhile, I'm thinking about what to do in a different spot, because sometimes I get hung up a little bit on things like certain building selections and, trying to find the next commercial building to put in this row or the next, residential building. And then I start to get so bogged down that I'm not really making any progress whatsoever. So I like to jump to something else just to sort of free up some brain cells and then work on a different area and then come back to it once I have an idea or a little bit of time away from it. Something that I found recently that I actually really like to do is working these pedestrian roads in along the beach. So it expands a little bit of the sidewalk of the road, right? I'm not really separating it because I want it to be more of an extension of what's there versus making something entirely separated from the road itself. Because we're in an urban area, I want to make sure that there's things between the water and coastline and the roads and infrastructure. Primarily just because we're in the city, right? If it was in a rural area, I could understand just having a road next to a coastline. So I think using the pedestrian road and some vegetation, I've been able to break up some of the monotony of just having a road along the coastline and make it a little more interesting. The pedestrian roads, I think, help a little bit. So it's like a little boardwalk area. And I thought that'd be cool tying it in with where the baseball stadium is. So it's like this whole area you can walk around and hang out and then eventually go to a baseball game. So we still need to fill some spaces up. So I had some inspiration. I saw like some recent images of an old stadium that they were kind of like building around, and the stadium's still functional. It's just not used for the same stuff, right? And what they had done is they had started going in and all the buildings around the stadium were being updated. So there was a lot of old commercial and some old worn down houses, and they went in and they started adding apartment buildings, some newer houses, and cleaning up some of the neighborhood to make it look a little better and to kind of update it in general because it had been pretty dated. And with that, I had this idea of like adding some of these condominiums to this area and some different type of, residential spaces that could go along with what we have already done in the city. So this is more of a continuation of what we've already set up in the previous episode, but still provides living space for a bunch of citizens. And of course, I'm leaning on something that I've seen recently, although this is quite different from what I've seen. I'm translating it into something that I can replicate here. This also fills up the sort of awkward space between the railroad and some of the roads around the stadium, which is pretty helpful because I was starting to struggle at what to put in these spaces. Ultimately, residential and commercial are pretty easy to fit in a lot of different places, but it can be hard to find the right building combinations. And I don't want to use the same buildings too much over and over, which I've already been kind of doing. So in some ways it's a compromise. In some ways you just have to keep playing with it until you find it. And there's always a Steam Workshop to go download just one more building that fits, right? So I'm trying to figure this out. I think we should discuss kind of where I see us going from here. To some degree, I want to continue to expand the city along the coastline, but I do realize we need to fill up another sort of midtown area, being the space that's kind of like on a little peninsula near the downtown. It was some of the road networks that I set up towards the industrial area. And then we're going to need to start adding industry soon. So I think those are going to be some focal points in the near future. I do want to create a pretty dense industrial park. And then we also need some sort of stuff set up along the coastline that operates kind of as a port. And I'm going to have to play with that a little bit and see what we can create. I made one a while back that was attached to a city that looked really good. And I hope that somehow I can kind of like replicate that success in this series and make it so that there's an area that looks, somewhat similar, but also still has the wear and tear of what you'd expect in a port. Really trying to blend the industrial areas with your port is going to make it seem very, very active and busy, which is exactly what I want. The other addition you can make around there is some old commercial and maybe some old apartment complexes and stuff like that that have plenty of wear and tear to it that don't look nearly as modern as some of the more recent buildings we've placed in the city. I think there's a lot of direction we can go as we start to leave the downtown area a little bit and expand into some other spots. I'd also like to get into some suburbs and stuff at some point. I want to do a really good American school with like a sports complex attached to it and have some fun in that regard. And then potentially we could get a college up. I really haven't dove much into that thought of like adding a college, but I think we're going to end up with a space that's going to work out well for that. And I do think I want to add an airport in the city somewhere. I'm just not exactly sure where that's going to go. I know I had an original intent for a direction of where it was going to go, but the way this has been coming together is a little bit more compact than I intended it to be initially. So I may have to adjust that accordingly. It's kind of impressive when I'm doing these videos to see sort of the changes that happen as we build. And as much as I try to plan, I'm really just drawing like a little bit of a sketch out of what I want. But by the time I get to really laying everything down, so much changes and sort of gets adjusted. One thing sometimes I have trouble with is just understanding scale in the game when I'm building. Like I've mentioned, I think I built my downtown much larger than it really needed to be. And that's something that, you kind of have to pay for if you don't adjust accordingly, right? Because then to scale everything else, you want to follow the scale you started with. And we tend to start with downtown, or at least I do. so that I can figure out everything else. So I'm having to adjust some things in terms of what I initially intended, but that's, kind of what happens. And ultimately, I still love the way the city looks, especially in this coastline area where we've created this whole space of like modern buildings and some offices and some commercial tucked in between the railroad and the water. There's plenty of stuff we can do. And one of the polls I did recently was, do you want a stadium? Do you want a water park? And I think water park was pretty high up in the votes, if I remember correctly. So that might be something we add at some point. Sully, an asset creator on the Steam Workshop, recently put out some really cool water park assets that are functional, and they use like a bus system in order to have people traveling down the water slide. So that might be something we incorporate in the city, because I think this would be really fitting for the city and based on, it being where kind of we've projected it to be, right? I think it would also be really cool to add some sort of golf course or something like that here, like a country club kind of vibe somewhere with a neighborhood attached to it. I've played with that on stream a little bit with some assets, so I need to see if that might be something we can incorporate down the road a little bit later in our build, but that would be a lot of fun. I think stuff like that is kind of cool for taking up space too, and just offering some diversity from just normal city building. It all goes back to creating points of interest, and I keep using that terminology, and really I think what it breaks down to is just finding different things that make the city unique, right? Whatever you're building, but also just giving you something else to build besides just roads, residential, commercial. You want to find some things that you can place like a signature building with or whatever and integrate it into your city in a cool way. And some of that may come down to how you design or plan your city, but it also can come down to, what region of the world it's in, what exists there or what would exist there. Because I imagine if you're anything like me, you need diversity in what you're doing. I tend to get a little bit too stagnant if I'm working on the same thing over and over and over. So I like to mix it up. I like to bounce around a lot. Sometimes it's a detriment that gets difficult to finish things. But again, it tends to help me keep a little bit free and moving and progressing versus getting stuck in one area and not really doing the things I need to do to make progress. Something I have been meaning to mention too is if you're going through my asset list or any asset list that you find from maybe a different creator or whatever, to ensure that you're looking at each asset. Now, this may seem a lot of extra work, but it's actually very helpful because I know, for example, that I've missed some dependencies that I needed to add to my asset list that I've either just overlooked or didn't add, or maybe I put them on the wrong list. And if you're downloading assets, you can cause an issue where you start to bog down your load time, stuff like that, where the game is looking for assets that are missing. That's why a loading screen mod is very helpful, and you can typically go back and track that. If you're downloading the list, like if you just go to the asset collection, you hit subscribe, you may miss some dependencies. So it's really good to go in and check and be a little bit more picky about what you're downloading. And the problem is that as you start to download assets, you end up in the situation where you might have just 500 assets, and then next week you have 600, and then 700, and then the number of missing assets continues to go up, and it just spirals out of control eventually, and you're really bogging down your system with that. And that's not really ideal anyway, because you may be missing important detail-oriented things like props and stuff like that for buildings that may actually be really helpful when it comes down to it in your build. And if you're unsure of what I mean by dependencies, well, if you have an asset that relies on other props that exist on the workshop, it'll typically list what props it needs so that it can be like its full-fledged version of that asset, right? So for example, a building might need a certain piece of signage. That signage may exist for other assets on the workshop and is on the workshop itself. So you may need to download that sign separately so that you have everything that was intended to be a part of that building. There's also things like air conditioner units that are on top of commercial buildings and stuff like that. There's several assets on the workshop that you may need to download that are referenced on other assets. So you need to make sure you're downloading those dependencies. Items that are dependent on other items. Make sure you get them all so that you're not missing assets. You can kind of keep up with that influx of new things you want to download. Separately from that, the mod list is another area where you need to be careful what you're downloading. It's easy to break a game. I typically start a city build and I keep with those mods for as long as possible without disrupting anything unless something's going wrong. And I'll be the first to admit that I'm not always up to date on mods. And I think I've mentioned that before, that some of my mods may be out of date. And the problem is I've already started cities with the mods that I had. And so I just have kept it going without disrupting anything because they work. And I've been made aware that some of the mods I have are currently out of date or depreciated, and I probably should go update them, but I also am concerned that if I do update them, I might end up in a situation where certain things in the city don't work or it just starts breaking, because as we all know, when you're playing modded in cities, it is a fragile environment. Now the game's not getting updates like it was, so we're kind of in this world where you think, oh, all the mods should be good to go. And for the most part, that is true, except that I think there's still some that are getting, some smaller updates to make sure functionality is good since some of the last cities updates have come out. So just word of advice, be careful what you download, make sure you're going through it and keeping track of what you're trying to add in terms of mods, assets, or anything from the workshop. And just keep in mind that the health of your city and your builds that you're doing rely on you being pretty careful with how you're handling, the asset accumulation and what you're doing to maintain sort of mods and assets in the long run. The better you do at this now, the better off you're probably going to be in the long run for your city build. You don't want it to just quit on you because you decide to update a mod or using something that's extensively out of date. Now back to our build. It took me a while again to get some of these buildings in place. I've tried to add some commercial pockets and some spaces because that does seem to be a pretty common demand this early in a city build anyway. And it's also fitting for the area, but it has taken me some time to find the right combination of things. And I don't know that I nailed it. I know I mentioned that earlier, that it was a little bit of a tough time figuring out what to put where. It doesn't fill the space the way it intended, just in general, the buildings surrounding the stadium. I think we have a decent amount of parking. You could argue that you should have more parking based on the size of the stadium, but I'm not that worried about it, other than I just want to make sure we have, plenty that exist here so that it looks realistic for what we're going for. It's kind of funny how you can have all the assets and all these things, but you still have to deal with trying to find what fits the puzzle, what works in these spaces, and what ultimately completes the vision you're going for. And oftentimes you got to get creative with how you fill some of these areas up. So I'll use some of these commercial buildings probably way too often just to fill those little nooks that you have in certain city blocks or certain areas, just to make sure it looks the way it needs to in terms of density, but maybe it's not a new building every time we start, making progress through the area. I think a lot of my concern with how this all fits is more so just like the placement of buildings than anything. Like, I feel like we have the buildings we need in the spaces we need them. We're just sort of missing some of the placement. Like, I might go in and tweak it. I might just leave it for now. I'm not really sure. Just some stuff I feel like could take up areas better, but I think we still need to work out and iron out some spots. So I'm gonna go ahead and time lapse through the last bit of this build, which is primarily focused on details. And there's a lot of details that I didn't quite get added in this video that I actually went back and added several hours after finishing recording. And some of that was just adding some things to make it look like the stadium had gates at various entrances, which I used from some shed props that I had found in my inventory just randomly. I did that, and then I added a little bit more greenery and stuff like that to some of the areas around the stadium and in between some of the modern buildings, along with some planters that also housed a bit of that greenery. Added some crosswalks and things to the road to help make it look like the paths had a little more purpose. And that way you have pretty set ways to enter the stadium area from the parking lots and from the commercial area across the street. Now, I'm not 100% sure I fully finished this area. Like, I'm not 100% sold yet. I do feel like it looks pretty good. I think there's some more detailing and things that I can add to this space to just, make it stand out even more, and maybe some adjustments to some buildings, and maybe place a couple more smaller buildings. I'm not really sure. I don't know quite what it needs, but I feel like there's just something missing. So if you have ideas, obviously post it in the comments below. I'd appreciate it. And we close out by adding some forest brush in some of these pockets next to the railroad and some of the commercial, just to give it a finished look. And forest brush is usually pretty helpful for this kind of thing. So we set out to get a stadium in place, and I think we've done that, along with adding some commercial, residential, and office space to help blend this area together. Stadiums can be a great way to create points of interest in your city, so I'd really recommend trying to incorporate these into your city builds. And I hope you guys enjoyed the episode. Big shout out to those on Patreon who support the channel. I really appreciate you, and I will catch you all next time.